Good evening, my name is Ondřej Matěk, I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute. I'm really happy to welcome you in our institute. As far as I can see, most of you are probably the first time here, so I'm really happy that you followed our invitation to the presentation of Kimberly, and I will be very short because I will hope that I will give the floor to Muriel Blev, which is our expert on international cooperation and who invited Kimberly to Prague, and we are happy that we can make this seminar in order to we have actually many seminars now in our institute for historians and on contemporary history. We try to open the doors, and I hope that even this seminar is a sign that we are on the right way. So Muriel, it's your turn.
Well, good evening. My name is Muriel Blev. I am advisor to the Director for Research Methodology and International Cooperation. We are very happy here at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes to receive Kimberly Elman-Zarakor, who I will briefly introduce. She was trained as an architect and as an architectural historian. She is Associate Professor of Architecture and Director of the Bachelor of Design program at Iowa State University. And she published the book she's presenting today in English in 2011 under the title Manufacturing a Socialist Modernity, Housing in Czechoslovakia, 1945-1960. She was a Fulbright research scholar in Ostrava at the Technical University in 2011-12. She already presented her work in Prague in 2011 and 2013, which raised a considerable degree of scholarly interest, and for a good reason, because as Michel Foucault would put it, a Penelak is not just a Penelak. It literally opens a window on the complexity of everyday life under socialism, and it does offer a fascinating insight into the formation of the communist states and its relationship to culture and industrial production. And that is also one of the reasons why this book is such a milestone in Czechoslovak communist studies. Kim, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and please proceed.
Thanks. Is this one on? Yes. Yeah? Okay. Sorry, I lost my arm here. Okay. Okay, perfect. Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming. There's many friends in the audience, and so it's nice to see you, and also many new people who I'm excited to share the work with. So I will speak in English tonight as advertised, but afterwards when we take questions, I can understand Czech, so please, if you're interested to ask questions, which I hope you will have, you can ask them in Czech. So as you're listening, don't be nervous to start to formulate some kind of question for me. So what I thought I would do is talk about the book as a project and talk about the book chapters and what I consider to be the arguments that I make in each of the chapters. And then say just a little bit about the content of each of the chapters, and then really just open the floor to questions. Because for me, after working on this topic now for 15 years, the most exciting thing for me is a chance to talk with all of you about the work, now that it's been translated into Czech. I think that finally, for everyone who's here, the content itself is accessible to you in a deeper way. You know, lots of people speak English, but I think it's really, for me, it's a huge benefit for you to have the whole text in Czech. And I want to give credit to my translator, Alena Beshetechkova, who did an amazing translation. So I hope that as you read it, that it feels like it's well done in every sense. So let me just get started. The book in English is called Manufacturing a Socialist Modernity, in Czech, Utváření, socialistické modernity. And here are the two covers. And I want to say to academia that I think the cover that they did for the Šťastné zítřky series is beautiful. And I like my old cover too, but somehow this one, the Czech one, is amazing. So you can see in this photograph something of my interests in technology, in construction, in the Panelop as an object that's not just a single building, but that is an industrial production, that it's an industrial object. And in both images, we see the gantry crane, we see the panels. In the one on the left, it's interesting because the workers have a much more manual-looking kind of display, like working with their hands. In this image that I have on the cover of my other book, it's from a distance, and it looks more like a kind of construction site in an industrial sense. But there's somehow both happening here, men working and also a kind of industrial scale production. So I made this summary slide for us to just frame everything that I'm going to say. As a researcher, I'm asked often about why, as an American, I would ever think to do a project about Czech post-war architecture. I think it surprises people that Panelox as a type interests anybody as a historical subject. But not only that, why an American would choose this in a language that I didn't know until I had to learn Czech to do this research, and I had to learn Czech history to do this research. But for me, it was really an academic project. So, in other words, I came at this not with an emotional connection to the architecture, not with an agenda to say something one way or the other about communism, but instead I formulated this very straightforward research question. How and why did the Czech architectural profession move from the style of 1930s avant-garde social housing to prefabricated concrete panel buildings in the late 1950s and after? So my formulation of this project is about continuities across World War II. And some of this is linked in part to my training. As some of you know, I studied with Kenneth Frampton at Columbia University, who I think is an amazing scholar of material culture. And he's very interested in buildings as the archive in and of themselves. And he really taught me to think about architecture at the nexus of politics and economics, social structure, culture, but also not to forget that the building is also a thing and that it has all kinds of components and connections. And his famous formulation of the concept of the tectonic is something that I take seriously. He's very interested in the avant-garde in the Czech Republic, and many of you know in his book, Modern Architecture, Critical History, he mentions this. And when I first learned Czech and I started to study Czech history, I thought that what I would write is about the avant-garde. This was back in 1999 when I first decided to learn Czech and to do Czech things. So in this set of 6 images, I thought that I would be writing about that first one as my dissertation. And as with everyone, the beauty of avant-garde architecture, the whole discussion around Karl Teige and how active Prague was and how much Le Corbusier and other architects admired what was happening, this was all very, very enticing to all of us in the States. You know, Prague is an amazing city, and then here we have this great architecture, so these two things together make it a desirable place because, you know, I've been coming here now for 15 years and I consider that a benefit of my project that I get to come back over and over again. So when I started to actually do the research though, I realized that there was already a large group of scholars here, working in Czech in particular, to write about the avant-garde. And in particular, I was interested in Brno at the beginning, with Fuchs and Wiesner and all these great architects who were working in Brno. And I thought this was the project. I thought I was going to write something about the avant-garde. But then I realized that people were already doing it, on one hand, and also the kind of historical questions that I wanted to ask. I knew that there was a lot of territory to cover between the 1930s and up into the 1950s and 60s, and ends up being the 50s in particular, 40s and 50s, but I wanted to cross this gap. And so I was very lucky. I had a teacher at Columbia who himself was an American who had learned Czech, who was a specialist on the communist period, named Brad Abrams. and he wrote a book about 1945 to 1948, and he was my teacher, and he really helped me to get deep into the questions of how communism emerged, and I used him incredibly as a resource. So I arrived in Prague in 2002, just after the floods, and the Národní technické museum archive was underwater. And so instead of having that place to work, which is what I expected, I ended up at the Národní archiv in Chodovec, and I was there every week for almost 10 months. And I decided from that point that it was my responsibility to take, out of all these documents that nobody had looked at ever, I was opening the files for the first time, cutting the strings, and no one had paid attention to this material since the 1950s. From all of this material, I needed to craft some kind of narrative about architecture. So I wasn't sure what I was going to say, and I didn't know what I was going to find. And so I just kind of dove in. And it took me a long time. So the dissertation doesn't get written until 2008, and then the book comes out in 2011. So from the first day of Czech class until the book is 12 years. And it took me really a lot of time to just process what I was finding. There's not a lot of sources to work with in Czech that are not primary, but are analytical sources. And so I'll just use this slide to kind of summarize, in fact, what I discovered. This question about continuity across the Second World War brought me to understand that there really was a pattern, a kind of set of stages that we can see among the architectural profession in the way that buildings are made and also the way that they look. And I would say that these are two separate things, how they're made and how they look. So if we see in the 1930s the famous social housing, which there was actually not that much of. In the Depression, of course, there wasn't a lot of money, but we have this famous project in Prague, and just gives a sense of a kind of interwar style avant-garde. So after the war, and I'll talk about these as a series of chapters, after the war we see immediately a desire to find a way forward as a socialist country, a country moving to the left, that there's a desire to find a housing type that can be repeated. And here I'm showing you the very first T series. This is T1, 1949, and it's Ministry of Technology and Stavroprojekt. I'll say a little bit more about that. Then we have the moment of socialist realism into the 1950s. This is an image from Poruba in Ostrava, some of you may be familiar with. And in the book, I have a whole chapter just about socialist realism, which was another surprise for me because I very naively thought, I don't want to write about socialist realism, it's terrible. And I also thought that I could avoid it. I thought that I could somehow make a kind of footnote to say, oh, and then there's socialist realism and let's move on. Turns out that I could not do that at all. Then we have the invention of the panelák. And this image from the cover of my book. These are the first paneláks in Prague. This is Zeleno Liško. Some of you will know it, behind Budějovická metro stop. These are the first buildings in Prague that are made on the model from Zlín. So I will talk a little bit about this, but panelák technology, in fact, is invented by architects who had, until 2 years before, been working for the Batje company. And then we're working in the Zlín and Gottwaldov office of Stavroprojekt, and there's this direct line to the panelák. And then these last two images are not so much about the book, but they, to me, say something about my original research question. We can see that the first paneláks look, so there's this first panelák looks a lot like the scale of the buildings from the 40s and the 50s, which for me is a really important point, that in the beginning, the panelák was a construction technology that made the same kind of buildings as traditional building materials, with the same size apartments, very similar size, similar number of floors in the building. But as the technology is utilized in a different way, the buildings start to go up. And first they go up in a way that is relatively elegant. You know, we have these tall towers. This is Kirch. And in this kind of picturesque image that makes them look very modern, and international. And then we go on to Petržalka, where everything just kind of explodes in all directions, up, across, and in number. And so for me, when I see these 6 images, I no longer see a lot of gaps. You know, if we imagine that somehow we went from the avant-garde mysteriously to horrible Panelaks, these 6 images say no. In fact, we can really understand the progression, we can see technologically the progression, we can understand politically the progression, and for me it starts to lay out a completely different understanding of the architectural profession, because I write a lot about architects. So there's 5 chapters in the book, and very quickly I'm just going to tell you what they are, and then I will talk about them. So chapter 1 is about 1945 to 48. And this is the moment after the war when there's, in politics, a kind of struggle about what will happen. We know what happens. Chapter 2, the creation of Stavoprojekt, which is established in September 1948. And as I write about in the book, architects had already created an organization for themselves that brought them all together and set up the opportunity to completely nationalize practice. And in fact, many architects were quite in support of this because it guaranteed them work and it guaranteed them a salary. And they believed in the idea of collective action, you know, that if they band together something like a union and all the architectural work goes through the union, then this guarantees people the opportunity to practice instead of the old model of having to go out and find clients. And even in 1946 and 47, this looks like a great strategy especially among the architects of the far left, of course. So then I have 2 chapters that deal with socialist realism in different ways. The first one, National Informed, Socialist in Content, is a kind of conceptual chapter that looks at socialist realism as an idea, and I talk about it as a method rather than a style, and this distinction for me is very important because it's a way of working, it's a way of approaching the project. It's not just a style in terms of you know, certain kind of decoration or what something should look like. It's really an approach. And the Czechs and the Slovaks tried to take it seriously, some of them. It was not just somebody from Moscow coming in and saying it has to look a certain way. And I try to write about it in a serious way. And as I said before, I thought I was going to ignore socialist realism. It has such a bad reputation. But what I discovered is, in fact, these socialist realist buildings are standardized Stavoprojekt types that have decoration around them. And so if I'm telling a story about standardization and typification, which is the making of the types, I can't ignore socialist realism because, in fact, it's in this period that the types really start to be confirmed and kind of taken in as the method is using types. Then I have a whole chapter on Jiří Krouha. Some of you may know this work. It was published in Czech many years ago already in the catalog about Jiří Krouha. I discovered in the archive material about Krouha and his atelier and the denunciation letter that led to the closing of the atelier. And essentially Krouha is just a fascinating character who had been known as an avant-garde architect who kind of took a wrong turn, but I think people honestly believed that after the war he didn't do much. He was a kind of figurehead. But in fact, Jiří Krouha built many, many more buildings after 1945 than he ever did before 1938. And so I show some of his projects from this period and talk about his complicated approach and some of his buildings, which elicit a lot of complicated feelings because some of them are very interesting. And yet he as a character is somebody that we have to really question. Okay, and then the last chapter, which for me, in terms of the Czech context in particular, I think is the biggest contribution. And you know, now I've been working on this so long, for me, I'm so used to talking about this chapter, and I don't know exactly what's new to anybody anymore. But essentially, this chapter lays out the history of the Panelák as a construction system, And it starts with the Bača system of construction from the 1930s and tracks what was going on in Bača and the architects who were working, the 1935 housing competition, the relationship of Karfik to Zlín and then to Bratislava, the role of Stavoprojekt and the design office in Bača, which come together at this point after the war, where what was the Bača office is simply converted to be the Gottwaldov office of Stavoprojekt. And looking at the Panelák as a construction system that really comes out of a genuine desire to push forward the production of architecture. If you need a lot of buildings for not much money on a very fast schedule, the Panelák is a great solution, right? And when we see it this scale, at the beginning, the apartments were relatively generously sized. The construction quality was quite good. And it seemed that they were modernizing the process. One of the big issues was that traditional construction had wet materials, like you pour your concrete floors into a skeleton slab building, and you can't do this in the Central European weather through the winter. So they were, in fact, really trying to find a system where all the components were dry, which allowed them to construct almost through the whole year. And I even found, I don't think this is in the book, but in the archive I found examples where another solution was they tried to use special heating systems to dry the wet concrete faster. That was another approach, but this is a much better system. You bring dry components to the site and you use these cranes, these gantry cranes, to put them together. And the top image, which is the one I had on my first slide, for me this is important to say that the Panelák is conceived together with the technology of its construction, which is this gantry crane. And also the first Panelák in this 1950 model is a Sorella Panelák. It has pilasters on the side. I don't want to end up moving somehow. Okay, here. So it has pilasters, which actually at the beginning were decoration to cover the uneven joints between the panel. It also has decoration at the roof line, that's kind of socialist realist. And then over the door, you can see a decorative, there's a little canopy and a little balcony, and these are early socialist realist details on this model of the first Panelák. So as you can tell, these two things converge in an unexpected way. So let me try very quickly to run through the chapters and just show you some of the work, and then I will open the floor for questions. So chapter 1, Phoenix Rising, this is about the re-emergence of the discussion about modernism after the war. One of the first things that happens after the war are that the groups of architects who had been distinct from each other in the 30s, like the various factions of more left-wing, the socialist architects, the ones associated with various schools of architecture, they all had these little organizations. And what happened after the war is they get together and they call themselves BAPs, the Block of Progressive Architectural Associations. It's bringing together all their energy. Here's Oldřich Starý, who was also the editor of Architektura ČSR for a long time, speaking to President Beneš in 1946. You can see all the men. There's no women around. Here are some of the characters who are very important to this story who show up in the first chapter. This is the architectural working group, Pracovní architektonická skupina. These were students of Karl Teige, who in the 1930s were very radical scientific functionalists. And these three guys, Karl Janu, Jiří Sturza, and Jiří Boženilek, become three very important characters after the war. This is another thing that I think I brought out that people were not so sure about or didn't realize, which is that you have these Teige characters, these Teige disciples, controlling basically the architectural industry for years after the war to really interesting results. So I've never been able to find a picture of Jiří Sturza as a young guy. If anyone has one, let me know. So very quickly, who's Karl Janu? He works at the Osidlovací úřad in the early 40s, which gives him some political capital after the war. He's the first head of the Czechoslovak Building Works, which is the corporation created in 1948 of the nationalization of the entire building industry. All the building contractors, engineers, and architects get put into this system. By 1951, he's studying prototypes at a research institute, and then in 1956, we would say in English, his star has risen again. He's back in the cool crowd, and they appoint him Deputy Minister of Building. So he has a very high position from 48 to 50. Then he's pushed back into the research apparatus, and he reemerges in 1956. Jerzy Sturza, maybe the one who had the most difficult situation. He starts by doing model housing developments, the Vzorné sídliště, and these are quite interesting projects. Then he you might say, makes a mistake by winning the Stalin Monument competition. He and his wife, Vlasta Sturzová, designed the foundations and the site plan for the Stalin Monument, where Otakar Svets's monument itself sits. For his work on this, he's rewarded by being the director of the architecture program at ČVUT for 2 years. And then, of course, politics are changing, and he's removed as director, but he stays on for many, many years at the university. And someone, the person I remember who is his student is Eva Jeržičná, talks about learning from Jerzy Sturza, so he's around for a long time. And you can see they lived very long, these guys. Jerzy Sturza didn't die till 1995. So Jiří Voženilek is maybe the one who, for me, has always been the most interesting. He leaves Prague in 1937. I found out that at the time he had 4 children. I found this in the archive, a little information about him. And I think he needed money because they weren't making any money. And so he takes a job at Batya. During the war, he's a resistance leader in Zlín. In 1948, his old friend Karl Janu calls him and asks him would he be the first director of Stavoprojekt. And he, at the time, was the head of the Batya design office in Zlín. And you can see here the plan for Gottwaldov that he did, that he's showing Gottwald. And so he has this high position in Zlín, and he's brought over to become the head of Stavoprojekt, which is the place where all the architects had to work. So he becomes literally the top architect. He has the same problem as Janu. In 1950, he gets pushed out. Kroha helps to push him out when he won't support socialist realism. He becomes head of VUVA, the Research Institute on Architecture and Urbanism, which is an organization that I'm hoping in the future I can do some more work on. I don't have the archive. I have to figure that part out. And then when Janu comes back, as in this cool crowd, so does Voženilek. He becomes the deputy minister for this of the State Committee for Construction, and then he's the head architect of the city of Prague in the 1960s. And he's a very complicated figure in terms of memory. I think people feel that he by the 1960s is a representative of some bad idea of communist architect bureaucrat. Okay, so what's going on? Well, there's no design work being built right after the war. There's a lot of ideas, but there's not actually buildings. The very first building built after the war is this Karfík building in Zlín. It's the Fučík quarter, if you know Zlín. And here we see the first step away from the single-family house, the duplex, and the floorplex of the Batya system to an apartment building. This is pre-communism, but they're already working at the apartment scale. Another thing happening at this time is the collective house in Litvinov. And the way that I set this up is to say there were 2 alternatives for socialist modernism. There's the avant-garde path, which the collective house represents. And Hilsky and Lienhardt were very influenced by Le Corbusier, and I write a lot about this in the book. And so it represents the previous idea of what socialism and modernism meant together. The other model is the Vzorné sídliště, the model housing developments. This is the one in Ostrava. A team is put together to do a master plan. There's United Nations money to support this project, and it was supposed to be a model, obviously. This is the kind of architecture that Anna Friedlova designed for Ostrava before 1948. These are the actual buildings that get built, renovated on the left and unrenovated on the right. And these buildings are in this in-between moment between the real avant-garde idea and moving towards something like a standardized building. They built 11 of these building designs. This is a winter garden. They're quite nice apartments. They're big and they're kind of modern in their conception. So in chapter 2, with the emergence of Stavoprojekt, we have the announcement in Architektur ČSR, September 1948, Stavoprojekt. This picture tells you all the workers support the creation of Stavoprojekt. This is the frontispiece for the journal that month, Architektur ČSR. Stavoprojekt is introduced with 8 working principles: typification, modularization, industrialization, prefabrication, a production plan, interdependence of design and implementation, research and documentation. So the point here is they are trying to create a systematic approach to architecture, coming through the institutional framework of Stavoprojekt, where all the architects were going to work. And what I'm showing you here is from the journal Architektur ČSR, which is a really interesting argument, which is that the industrial city of the 19th century, the capitalist industrial city, puts its workers in barracks and kind of is the worst of the capitalist model. Whereas in the Slovak village, we see typification, the repetition of a type, in the context of a village that has a housing type that works, and then you make many of them. And they're saying that they call this natural typification. And this is what they are trying to do. So they're also looking to Japan. And I was able to find out that this image comes from a book from the 1930s that was in German about Japanese architecture. And I've always been interested in the way that the module is used here, because it's very similar to how modules would be used in the future, where you start with a module and you build out your spaces and kind of the project using these modules. And of course, Batya. So this is already part of the conversation. This chart for me is also an important moment. It is a chart of the use of standardized types around the world in 1950. I don't need to translate anything here, which is fantastic, unlike usually. But what I want you to see is that Czechoslovakia has the fewest number of types. There's only 2 in this chart. And the darkness of the line shows you the number of times that it is used. So something light is not used very much. So if you look at Czechoslovakia, essentially 1 building is being used as the type. If you look at all the other countries, including the Soviet Union and Denmark and Switzerland, you see more variety. So one of the arguments is that the Czechoslovak system went very quickly towards standardization and typification. This chart is in Architektur ČSR. So they start by trying to make these types. And I go through in very systematic detail who's doing what and kind of the conversations. But essentially a committee is put together to look at housing types. The very first one they come up with is called a T1, type 1. And it's in Praha Prosek that they build the first one, and this is what it looks like, and these are the rooms inside. And this is meant to be a test of what socialist modern architecture might look like. You can see the pitched roof is different than the Friedlova project from Ostrava. That this is something that is coming, a kind of vernacularization. Here's a T-series in Ostrava and Bielski Les, unrenovated. I use these old pictures now because whenever I go back to any city, the buildings are disappeared under styrofoam. So some of these pictures are now themselves historical objects because you can't actually see the building anymore the way that it was. Okay, so the 3rd chapter, National Informed, Socialist in Content. So my argument is that the pressure from the Soviet side to make architecture that looks more like their expectation doesn't really start until 1950, and you can read in the book all of the reasoning for this. Here we have these hilarious pictures from 1952 of 5 Czechoslovak architects, and there were Czechs and Slovaks in this group, on their journey to the Soviet Union. And here they are in various places in the metro. I think this is Stalingrad at the top. And the magazine just shows them doing all of this touring. So they are doing the ritual of showing up in the Soviet Union. The kind of architecture that results are maybe you're familiar with Podbaba, with the Hotel Internacional, which keeps changing names but is now a very fancy hotel, always was, I guess. There was originally supposed to be an army headquarters building that doesn't get built on the Davica Circle, and these projects are what we expect of socialist realism. You can see them as kind of copies of the Soviet idea, but smaller. I think it's always important to say that the scale of the architecture here was always smaller. They created a journal called Sovietska Architektura to bring the knowledge from the Soviet Union to Czech architects. They translate Soviet texts. They write about what the appropriate sources for Czech architects should be. You know, national in form, socialist in content. You need your national knowledge to create the form. And so here we have, just as an example, a Soviet building, but we also have articles like this that talk about Litomyšl as a source for socialist realist design. And we also have over here this the top of the building copied in some ways from the one in Litomyšl, and there's also a Tabor tower that you guys might be familiar with from the Hussite time that's also a popular motif. And what I discovered is that essentially you have standard Stavo project types, these just block buildings with prefabricated, made out of concrete and terracotta and stuff, stuck on details to create the socialist realism. But the building is still the same kind of building that was in these types. Another thing that happens are these two representative cities. The first one is what we now call Poruba. In Ostrava, it originally was going to be New Socialist Ostrava, and here's the original project for it. The only part that gets built, as seen here, is right here, the first and second district of Poruba. Everything to the left of the arrow to this side doesn't get built, and everything on the other side is built in a different way. But this is Poruba in its original form, and you can see there was supposed to be a canal. There's an interesting little historical footnote that there was going to be a canal between the Oder and the Dunaj rivers, and it was going to go through this part of Ostrava, and they would have a waterfront in Poruba. And originally this was supposed to replace the entire city center, the historic city center. They were going to tear that down because there's coal to mine underneath it. They don't do that, and Poruba becomes more like a residential district. Originally, Meduna does a very Soviet-inspired design, large scale, really classical. You can see it looks kind of strange when you know what actually was built. And then this is a map of what was actually built, and I talk in the book about these diagonal buildings, which are from the 1940s. And they use this oblok, the arch building, to hide them as you're coming into Poruba, so that you see more of the socialist realist design. This is what Poruba looked like in the mid-1950s. Many of you have probably been there, and if you haven't, it's definitely worth a trip out to Ostrava to see. Poruba is the Czech showcase for socialist realism, but when you realize what it really looks like, it has different connotations, a different kind of idea than Soviet socialist realism, at least in its scale. So for example, here we have the Poruba Tower building, and then Schwarzenberg Palace in Prague. And you can see that in Poruba, they're borrowing at the top of this building the detail off of something like Schwarzenberg Palace. And this was shown in Architektura ČSR in 1952. So it's not that it was unknown, but this was the encouragement. Find national architecture from the Czech Renaissance period and use it as a source for decorating Sorella buildings. But inside of this is still Stavoprojekt standard kind of construction and also floor plans. Okay, so Jiří Kroha. He was a modernist in the interwar period. He was a longtime communist. He is teaching Marxism to his students in the 1930s in Brno. He actually is put on trial at one point for being too much in support of communism, which is unusual in the 30s, but really did happen. He never actually ended up in jail, but he lost his university position. After the war, he was let's say he was in with the top politicians. Here we have Zapotocky and Gottwald sitting with Kroha at the Slavic Agricultural Exhibition in Prague, which is already in preparation in February 1948. And Kroha was friends with one of the Brno communists, one of the important ones. And so I think this was his connection. And Otto Schick, and he gets wrapped up with these top politicians, which is his end soon after. But at the time, it gave him incredible access. So here, for example, he does the stage design for the 9th Party Congress in 1949. So the signage and these panels and the roof, these are done at Kroha's special Atelier Narodního Umělec. So he gets his own atelier. He's the only architect in the whole country. And this atelier gets special projects. Here is the Morphology Pavilion at the Medical College in Olomouc, a very hidden Kroha building. It's there if you ever want to go see it. Nobody really pays attention to it, but he did do these medical buildings in Olomouc. He also is hired to do Nova Dubnica. Some of you may be familiar with this project. It's near Dubnica nad Váhom in Slovakia. And this project was the first town-scale work that his office, his atelier, was given. It's a whole small settlement. It was designed to house workers from the local factory in Dubnica that made weapons and other things that were related to the military. And it's done with these ensembles. The architecture is very unusual. I was able to go thanks to Osamu, who drove me, so he's with me when I'm taking these pictures. And it's this out-of-the-way place, and it has very unusual architecture that I actually was able to link back to Fourier, the phalanstery in France in the 19th century. In the Kroha archive at the Museum Miasta Brna, there are panels that show the phalanstery, so to show in relation to this project. So it's not me. Kroha is looking at that. The buildings have these very unusual spires on them. They are standard Stavoprojekt buildings. This building here is a standard Stavoprojekt building, a T20, and it has decoration that Kroha did himself. Here you can see it in the very early moments of its existence. Very strange spire on the top, very creative kind of decoration. And this is socialist realism, but it's Kroha's version of it. Oh yeah, here's a close-up on this one of the unusual spires here. Okay, so next thing that happens is Kroha's office is asked to rescue one of the Vzorné sídliště that had stalled in its design. This is the original plan for it. Kroha is asked to redo the design and to put in some representative early 1950s buildings instead of the modern buildings that had been part of the original project. So these are some of the buildings that Kroha's office designed for the model housing development. These two on the top are the gate buildings, and this one on the bottom is just one side of that. And you can see that it's symmetrical. It frames this main avenue, which leads you down into the center of what's now Bielski Les. And you can see here that there's a department store in the original design. Kroha's office did the design. This is the House of Culture that is still there as well. Very unusual take on socialist realism, not super decorative, but somehow you can see in this building a relationship back to Kroha's work in the 20s, where he's interested in a kind of volumetric architecture, these circular windows, the way the roof line works. Okay, so the last chapter. And how am I doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay, so this is the chapter about Panelaks. And I think I could do it quickly as well, but this is where, when we're doing the questions, I assume some of the questions will be about this, and I could do 2 hours just on this. So this is about Zlín and the evolution of the Panelák. So panel construction technology was not a Czech invention by any means. Modernists had been trying to figure out the panel as a construction mechanism since the 20s. Here we have two German examples. We have Ernst May at Praunheim in Frankfurt, And we also have something called the bronze system, which was a commercially available system that was used for some projects in Berlin. The problem here is they could never really go above 2 stories. They hadn't developed the technology to keep the buildings stable above two levels. I guess here maybe it's 3. So, but they're low buildings. These are not tall, and they're experimental. There's not that many of them. So I'm skipping way ahead, but here are this is Bohumir Kula and Hinek Adamets, 1941. During World War II, German overseers are in control of the shoe factory in Zlín, which the family has liquidated most of their assets out of the factory, and the family has relocated for the most part to Canada and to Switzerland. But the wife of Tamas Bate, who's dead already at this point, is still in Zlín and trying to kind of oversee the overseeing of the factory. And they run it like a research institute. I think a lot of you probably know this about Batia, but during the war, they brought a lot of scientists and researchers who had been kicked out of the university, and they brought them to Zlín and they encouraged them to continue their research. So, for example, this is another footnote, Victor Lee, the chemist who invented contact lenses, he spent World War II at Batia inventing synthetic materials that eventually lead to the contact lens. So these architects are part of this research apparatus. They are given a job as Batia architects, make a Batia duplex, a famous Batia duplex, out of panels. Can you do it? And this is what they produce. And thank goodness, Professor Schwacha, went for me to Zlín and got a ride around with a local architect. And he found this building, this experimental panel house, before they had covered the second side. Because on the right side is already styrofoam. And on the left, you can see the panels. They're tall and skinny. They're not structural. The building is held together by the band that wraps around the center. And they were making identical floor plans and identical volumes and shapes and distributions of the buildings. The idea is that it's the same dvoidomek as Batia built out of brick, but here it's panels, and for all the reasons that are obvious about the economic benefit. Here's the next evolution. It's called Type A, and you can see in the construction photographs 2 things. You can see the panels very clearly, and that they are held together with some kind of support mechanism along the top. The panels are hollow, some of them, to run utilities through. And interesting to me, or I think to everybody up top, is that the crane that lifts the panels runs in what will be the street. So you can see that what looks like a railroad track, this becomes the street, but it's the place that they put the crane. This is the same way that Gropius did the construction of the Torten settlement when he was at the Bauhaus, is the street is the place where the crane is. And here they are with styrofoam over them, looking like very picturesque Batia duplexes, and they are in fact prefabricated panel buildings, not panelogs, but you would never know. It looks the same as the brick once you put the styrofoam on it. Here are the floor plans. I'll skip through this. The point here is that it's the same kind of Batia house that he was building, the company was building for years. Big jump, really important jump. In 1949, Kula and Adamets make their first apartment building that's bigger than a duplex. And this is it. It is made with the same tall panels. I hope you can see them. This cursor is not working well for me, but here's a panel. And here is a ribbon stripe around the building that's holding it together, literally holding it together. They didn't quite know yet how to do this. And the funny thing, this is going to sound strange, but the funny thing to me is I found this picture in the photographs I took of my students from Iowa, who I took through Zlín at one point, and I didn't know this building mattered at all. I was just taking pictures of them kind of walking around, and as I flipped through in my later research, I discovered I had a picture of this building, which was fantastic. So you can see this is the first panelized apartment building in Zlín. So the this was already after communism, obviously. the drive was to go from the system of construction that required large blocks and poured concrete floors to try to go to a building without a skeleton. And this is an illustration that came from a 1953 construction textbook, just something that I found in the National Library, but I love this diagram. I've been using it for a long time. And you can see the 4 stages, and the desire was to reach stage 4. And you can, hopefully you can see what happens at stage 4. Very specifically, you lose the structural skeleton, these what we would call in English sticks. They go away, and suddenly it's just all panels. And the panels are these dry, prefabricated, factory-made panels. So what happens at Stavo Projekt is they set up in the Institute for Prefabricated Buildings, which had a location in Gottwaldov, which had been Zlín. It also has a location in Prague. They set 4 research teams on the 4 systems that are in this diagram. They tell one team, test the large block poured floor, test the masonry facade and the prefabricated panels. They test the system where the panels are everywhere, but there's still a structural skeleton. And finally, they want to do a panelak. So here, for example, is system 2. And this is Karl Janu. Sam Karl Janu is in charge of the prototyping. They do it in Otrokovice, which is very close to Zlín. And this is 1954. And you can see this hybrid kind of brick bottom, large blocks, panel system down here. This is an experiment. What's it like to do system 2? Here is Karl Honzik, the Karl Honzik, drawing system 3. There was anxiety about the plainness of the facades. This is an image from Architektur CSR, where Honzik is sketching out possible ways of decorating the facade for system 3, which is known also as something called the Wimmer system, 1954. In the meantime, Karfik is doing other things in Bratislava, experimenting. He comes up with something called the BA system. And the BA system is a hybrid. It is not a panelak, although most people would refer to it as a panelak. And this is a contrast to those 4 steps, where you have pre-stressed concrete frame, and then you liquid pour the infill in the frame, and the frame itself is structurally sound, and this is a much more flexible system than a panelak, particularly because you can have doors and windows on any side. So if any of you have really thought this through, you'll realize that in at least the early panelaks, all the windows are in the wall that is perpendicular to the dividers. Okay? And the doors are the same unless they're near the staircase, which is a monolithic concrete piece. So in other words, you're really locked into the boxes in a early panelak, and probably in all panelaks, I guess. And here you have more flexibility, and Karfik, the great Bati architect, understood all of the kind of challenges of prefabrication, and he was trying to experiment. In the meantime, we have Kula and Adamets, the Bati architects, now working for Stavo Projekt in Gottwaldov, make the first system 4 model. Okay, this is just a model like on a table. This is called the G house for Gottwaldov. And this is 1950, I've already said something about this, and as I said, the fact that the gantry crane is here for me is kind of a spectacular image of how these things go together, the making and the way it looks. So this is the first panelak. This is a G40. It's named 40 because there were 40 units in the building. Later they start naming it by year, so you go from a G40, the next one is a G57 for 1957. This is 1954, designed in Zlín. And just to reinforce what I was saying, you can see here the doors and windows are all in that perpendicular wall, except for when you have the circulation stair, it allows you a door into the apartment on the opposite wall because the stair itself is a stabilizer of the structure. Here are the G40s that are in Zlín. They are in an area by this river just over the bridge from the center of Zlín, a little bridge, and in that neighborhood are other experimental buildings from earlier, but these are really a milestone. You're talking about my research as a milestone. This is the milestone. This is the Panelák, and a lot of people are not believing this, but this is true. Skeletonless building. You can see that the pilasters are covering the joints. There's still a little bit of a decorated door, but not the same as in the model, because we're already in 1954, and socialist realism is a little bit in a different spot. And then this is what it looks like when they renovate them. It's a kind of early renovation, not pink and purple and green. Okay, so G57, just to talk a little bit quickly about the actual technology. You guys all know this better probably than I do. This is a bytové jádro. This is one of the original designs for a bytové jádro, with the kitchen, bathtub, sink, and toilet in the box. This is from the archive at Chodovec. The floor plans for the G57, which is built in 1957. Here's the hook and staple system. So Paneláks are put together by hooking and welding these staples through these brackets, these round kind of hooks that are embedded in the prefab panel. And then they fill that in with a kind of mortar, and then you can see that there's a PVC joint up there, kind of filler piece. They fill this all in, and that hooks everything together and gives it stability. Here's a panel. You can see that the way that the hooks are done is that they're upside down V-shaped hangers. Then they cut away at the top of that hook, and that's where the staple in this welding happens. And my understanding of this is that they're in from the corner to add some stability, because if you think about hooking at the corner, they'd be kind of wobbly, but by going in, you are setting up a stronger structural system if you're away from that weak corner. And here is looking at the cut, the section through the wall, looking down at the building, and the corner piece that hides the gap that's created by the panels at the corner. So it's a cover piece, and you can again see 3 staples, and you can see something about the system of the Panelák. So the buildings. Yeah, there's 2 slides. Okay, great. So G57 under construction, the cover image of my book. Hopefully as we arrive here you sort of feel that you know this a little bit differently, and you can see that these are skeletonless buildings. Here's the construction process underway. Very few men are needed. The gantry crane is mobile. They have a whole kind of prefab system, obviously. And then these are the G57 buildings after they've been renovated in Prague. This is what they would look like if you go visit today. And then my very last slide. So these are just a few of my thoughts about the future of the Panelák. There's not been mass destruction. There's substantial sums for renovation. Most Paneláks have been renovated to improve the thermal quality. Because energy was cheap, it wasn't such a priority to have good insulation before 1989, but now that you're in the same energy market as capitalist countries, you don't want to pay, obviously, for all that. So there is incentive to improve the thermal. Covering the buildings with polystyrene. It's coated with stucco and then painted, and you all know the results. New windows, new elevators, front doors, lighting. In the individual units, many people have removed the old kitchen and bathroom, these bytové jádro. And as you know, there's a big industry to actually put new boxes in. And if you give them your Panelák number, they already have the dimensions of your bytové jádro. So it makes the whole system very efficient in that sense. And then with the improvements, one of my new questions is what's really left of the original Panelák? If you've covered the facade and you've replaced the kind of apparatus inside, what do we have left? So I will leave it there. Hopefully it didn't go much past 6. How'd I do?
Oh, that's perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. And we're very pleased to hear about the successful capitalist transformation of the Panelák.
another conversation that I hope we'll have.
So I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. And in fact, you probably know the people in the audience much better than I do, so maybe you should be the one selecting them.
So, yes.
I have a question. Maybe in this early 50s, was there any communication between other countries where similar development occurred, or it was really isolated research that was done in Zlín and very original and unique?
So there was lots of communication, but most of it were other people coming to find out what the Czechs and Slovaks were up to. So, in other words, Czechoslovakia was out in front in some of these technologies, particularly because of the Baťa knowledge. So we can find in the archive delegations of East Germans and Russians coming, and they will request to see the panel factories, and they will request to see the building sites of like Zazeleno Liško in 1957, because they want to see what's happening. So I think there was quite a bit of communication in Stavoprojekt. They were able to get the foreign journals and keep them in these secret places for the architects to see, kind of professional communication. I think for a while the Czechs felt that they were more sophisticated than a lot of other countries as a leftover of being such an industrialized country in the 1930s. The communication to East Germany was not so open because of the political kind of historical relationship. You don't see a lot of, or I didn't see a lot of people looking so much to Germany, but I just think it's a bias at the time. But the Germans were no farther along. Like Stalinallee, for the most part, is built with traditional construction materials, and you don't really have massive prefab until the later 1950s. So my perception is that the French had the Camus system. Some of you may know what that is. Independently done. Never have I been able to truly understand the relationship between those two, but Camus seems to have come about a little earlier, like months or a couple years. But the Baťa knowledge is so long in developing that you can't really say that they went and stole the Camus system, if that makes sense. So they were all on this path towards it, and Czechoslovakia got there before most of the other countries. But one thing that maybe other people know about or could help me with, but I've never understood why nobody came to buy the technology from here. The Russians purchased mostly French and Scandinavian technology because they never really succeeded in independently inventing their own. And you don't find, like in Hungary or Poland or any countries, you don't find licensed Czechoslovak panel technology. And I'm not sure why. Like you'd think that the knowledge would move, but it didn't seem to. So this is something I'm hoping other people can, that there's, as I start my research, other people start theirs, and we can all kind of go in that direction. I did just talk to somebody who's a Soviet specialist who told me that they bought the French technology, but they copied it basically. Like they purchased it, and then they built their own system with the knowledge of what they were able to copy off of the French and kind of adapt to their climate, which was very different. So the Soviet situation is getting some attention, and that's exciting for me because for 15 years I didn't have many people who could tell me about Soviet panel buildings, even though we know there's 60 million apartments in former Soviet Union that are prefab panels. So somebody's got to know. 60 million is a lot.
If I may, I have a related question. How much more advanced were the Czechs compared to the other Central Europeans?
In which sense?
In the sense of building the panel? Yeah.
I would say that advanced is a relative term. So for example, the Hungarians didn't want to make panel buildings. They really resisted, and only 30% of their housing was industrialized. So they didn't want to be out in front. Yeah. I would say that based on what I've seen in terms of the quality of what's remaining, the Czechs were among the best. Because if you look at Polish panel buildings, they're kind of falling apart. If you go farther east, the quality of construction goes down. I think one question would be about East Germany, and I think that probably they were equally sophisticated, but I know that the Czechs got there first. So in terms of you know, the East Germans were looking to Czechoslovakia, they were visiting, they were, you know, they were trying to figure out sort of what was actually happening. Everyone had panels. I should say that everybody had panel construction, but the sophistication here was without the skeleton, the true panelák. So a building that hooks all the panels together and manages still to stay up. And think about how tall paneláks get here, you know, 14, 18 stories. They still have no structural skeleton in a true panelák. And so this requires a lot of work from the guys who figure out the construction, you call it statics, that's not how we say it in English, but the statics of the building are very, very complicated, I would guess. And think that there's been very few buildings that have had too much structural damage or difficulty. I heard one of the problems with Czech paneláks were in the ceiling panels. So certain of the types have had to have replacement roof panels. And otherwise, I think you have all seen that, you know, balconies don't fall off of Czech paneláks like they do in the Soviet Union. The buildings don't fall, they don't fall down. They just are really poorly insulated. They're drafty and they're noisy. And there are things you can do about that. But from a technology perspective, they were quite advanced. And this is all, you know, this is the inheritance, right? This is the 1920s and 30s, industrial enterprise, modernization, all of this carries. Because most of the architects who practiced in the 1930s practiced in the 1950s, or 1940s into the 50s. This is another dimension, which is incredible continuity among people. So you don't have that many architects dying in the war, and you have only one high-profile emigre architect, who is Jaromír Krejcar, and he dies within a year anyway. So there's not, I mean in the sense if he had stayed, he wouldn't have been around long. So you don't lose the knowledge, you don't lose the professionalism. Think about Josef Havlíček. You know, he's 1947, he's in New York, he's one of the 10 members of the United Nations design team. He comes back, he's head of the Stavoprojekt office in Prague, and he's around for a long time, and he's still building buildings. He builds Sorella buildings, he does other things that he finds not very agreeable, but he's there, and he's quite a great architect. Yeah, so they have their knowledge. Questions?
I have a small related question to, but you mentioned that in Hungary there was pretty much resistance against the new building materials and panel building. Was it by any chance because the housing situation wasn't that bad, or they were not as crammed, or they didn't have to fulfill a promise like they had to in Czechoslovakia, where it was promised like 200,000 new apartments, you know, when the only chance to actually meet that requirement, very partially though, was with the panel building. So I would be interested in that. I
don't know so much about Hungary, but I'll answer the question in a little bit different way, which is that my argument in the book, and I think it's an important one, is that already in the 1930s in Czechoslovakia, Tajge and his students and the other people in what's called the scientific functionalist movement were already pushing for standardization, typification, industrial production. Karl Janu makes the drawing of the bytové jádro long before communism. It exists already in the late 1930s, this idea. So the argument that I make is that these people who in the 30s were already behind these ideas because of politics, because of the power situation among the ministries and sort of who knew who, and the fact that Janu worked at the Osidlovací úřad, which gave him a lot of clout, it allowed them to drive the conversation. And I think that in Hungary, you don't have the same situation. You have a different inheritance from the 1930s, and you don't have the knowledge base of this industrial production as much as you have here, and you don't have these architects who are in charge, who are telling the whole Stavoprojekt system, make standardized types, repeat them, provide to the regional offices typified plans, the work of the offices to situate it in a particular place. This is a real approach to architecture that I guess I would say in some sense is not a communist approach. It's facilitated in its overarching kind of dominance of the situation by the way that the planned economy worked and the way that everything was shut down, all the private stuff was shut down. So in other words, these guys were prepped. They were ready. And they really went after it when they were given the chance. And so this is why I make the case that Czechoslovakia, to Muriel's question, is a little bit different. Because you don't have this strong 1930s relationship. Because in some other countries like Germany, think about what the Nazis did in the Soviet Union, think about what Stalin did with modernism. This is where, you know, historians have started to question this narrative of the democratic, wonderful interwar years. But in terms of architecture, you really can see that there is something here different than in other countries around it. But the lasting of the modern movement all the way into the war. Yeah.
What was the reason for the historicism in socialist realism? I mean, why did they start picking up these historic types, and why the Czechs seem to source their historic types from Renaissance, while the Russians or the Soviets seem to use Gothic or something? Are there any reasons behind it?
So the theory of, or the method of socialist realism argues that the radiant future, the radiant socialist future, that the socialist man is going to be rewarded with a kind of beautiful life like rich people had in the capitalist period. So it's about cultural memory and kind of sources. So the architecture of the palace is very resonant, and the zamek is very resonant because it represents a kind of rich lifestyle. And so I think actually in the Soviet Union is huge territory, obviously, and also many different variations of socialist realism. If you go down into what we call now the newly independent states, you see a lot of Muslim influence and sort of Central Asian stuff. I think in the cities of the western part of the Soviet Union, you have a lot of references to France and the kind of imperial St. Petersburg period. And the Czechs went to their 16th century architecture because they felt that it was the last great moment of Czech culture before the loss at White Mountain. And so they're looking for their great kind of, to resurrect the greatest of the Czech culture. And this is why when I talk about socialist realism as a method and not a style, the actual form of the buildings is rooted in this understanding that what you're trying to do is build up a national identity for your architecture. So in the Soviet Union, that national identity has a lot to do with imperial Russia, I would say, in terms of references. And here it's all about pre-Habsburg times. And so I think that the motifs are, like I said, about this radiant future, this promise that you're making, that if people give all of their labor to the state, what they get in return is this lifestyle of rich people. You know, that this is the agreement that you're making. And it's very hard to get away from this view of these palaces as the thing that represents something special and good. Eva is here from Ostrava, and we spend a lot of time in Poruba, which is this socialist realist district. And in Ostrava, this architecture is considered to be high quality and very desirable in the neighborhood. There's a lot of green space. The buildings are very well constructed. They, in general, are in pretty good shape. And they're not Ponelocks. It's all made with traditional construction. And so there's a struggle for people to embrace the architecture because it comes from this Stalinist period. But as architecture, people can't help but think, this is beautiful, walking through these courtyards and these parks and through the arches and to see the coffered ceiling. And, you know, I think we all carry it with us, that the architecture of the castle, of the villa, this is something emotionally in memory that we carry, and this is what I think that is this reference. Yeah.
I've got a question regarding the size of the phenomenon. How many Palaks from 1950s or early 1960s are there really?
Yeah.
Because compared to the construction boom in 70s, early 70s to early 80s, I think it might be rather a fringe phenomenon and a thing that is not that dominant.
So there's a couple things. One is that true Panelaks are not dominant, certainly, but large block construction and moving towards industrialization is very dominant. So even Poruba, that I just was mentioning, are not Panelaks. If you look at the construction photographs, it's not traditional masonry construction. They actually have unskilled laborers putting together large blocks of bricks on the ground, covering it with kind of cement and plaster, and then moving those large blocks up onto the building. So it's a combination of unskilled and skilled labor. So that's one thing that it's not a hard line between industrial and non-industrial. By 1960, 17% of apartments are Panelaks. So the first ones are built in 1955, and within 5 years, it's 17%. Obviously, that's still a relatively small number, but we're still talking thousands of units. And you find them across the country. There's the Prague set that I showed you that are the first. There's the Zlín set that are the true first. And they start to show up. In Bratislava, there's actually interesting various experiments in the 50s with this BA system that's not a true Panelak, but it is very industrially produced. I think that it's going to be someone else's job or very hard to actually count. I don't know how we would do a count of the true 1950s Panelaks besides the really famous ones. But I would say that because in the architecture magazines, it's featured very, very prominently, starting already in 56. The Panelak technology, the French, the Camus system, there's an article about the Camus system and about the Cognier system, another French system in 1956 in Architectura CSR. In 1958, Vladimir Chervenka writes a book about housing where he features all these different kind of industrial technologies. So even if it's a fringe phenomenon in terms of how many are built, all architects are aware that this is the technology that is coming and is being sought. And one of the interesting things about Jiří Krouha and the closing of his office in 1956 is that in the record of the in the meetings where some of you probably know this because it was published a long time ago in Umění, but there's a record of a meeting of the employees of his office, and they're all yelling about how bad he was as a boss, and that he's this tyrant and stuff. And one of the things he says in the context of all of this yelling is that he does not support the Panelak, that this is going to be the end of architecture, basically, that he sees it coming, that everybody's complaining about what he does, but the panel building is going to shut down all creativity and all kind of inspiration in architecture. So he feels, he was responsible in some sense for pushing out the technocrats in 1950, and then they basically push him out in various ways in 56 and rise back up, if that makes sense. So I would say that even though it's fringe in terms of numbers, it's central in terms of discourse starting in 56. I mean, there's just no question that this is where everything is going. It's just how fast. One of the problems is they had to build panelaren, they had to build panel factories. It's a big production, and it economically there's a calculation about making the panel at the factory and putting it on a train or a truck and bringing it to the site, and you need to space the panel factories a certain distance to make it economical compared to doing traditional construction. So in the late 1950s, they start building panel factories all over the place. Like in Ostrava, they build a panel factory, but it's not, I think, until 59 or 60, and they build it close to where they want to start putting up industrial buildings. But until that point, there's no panelaks in Ostrava, because it just doesn't make sense economically. So it's like they have to build up a huge infrastructure to start pumping out the buildings. Because for a while, the cost of moving the panel is too expensive to justify. So Zlín has a factory, Prague has a factory. I'm sure that there's other cities with these factories early. And within a distance of that factory is where you're going to start to see the buildings first. And by the 60s, they're everywhere. Yeah.
I agree that it's rather a matter of discourse, but I see some problem with the size and the importance of this discourse for the whole society, and even for the highest ranking politicians, or the headquarters of the Communist Party, because they were heavily criticized by mid-50s for not paying too much attention to housing construction in general. That's why this document on housing came in 1959 or 1960. So surely, but now when speaking about the idea of panelák and the panelák itself, and for instance its renovation, I suppose most people have the models from 1970 or 1980 in mind, whereas these unique French things might kind of distort the idea.
Yeah, I think that the 60s is actually the point where you start to really get the massive scale. So Pankratz and Novodvorska and some of the Prague sídliště that we now think of as being in their urbanism quite elegant. This is the jumping off point for this massive production, and I think those are still, Jižní Město and Petržalka represent a kind of stage 2 in this development, where the construction quality changes and where the urbanism starts to lose its high modernist sensibilities of the low building and the towers and these beautiful walkways that we see in some of the sídliště. There's the elevated street in Jižní Město, but it's really just at one moment. And so I would say, yes, it's true that when people think about paneláks, they're thinking more about these bad ones later on. But for architects, I guess one of the things that I wanted to try to do with the project is to kind of dig out a sense that they were really trying to make nice buildings with a new construction system at the beginning, and things, I don't want to say, I'll say conspire against them by the 70s. Not good quality construction materials, bad work ethic of construction workers, pressure to make many apartments very, very quickly so they get smaller. There's many plastics that are brought in that didn't exist before. All these contribute to the poor quality in the 70s and 80s. And I don't think it's necessarily the architects doing, in a sense. I think that everything outside of the design process means they can't make better quality ones at that time, if that makes sense. Yeah? Lena?
I'd like to come back to previous question about national inform and socialist in context. It is chapter 3, and this is the main motto of Stalin nationality policy of 20s. So, and
well, actually, it's from 1933, from the formulation of socialist realism. Yeah.
And but it is not about pressure to transfer to copy Soviet model of socialist realism, but original motto is about emphasizing like very, very national motifs or element in design, for example.
So hang on, so the question, the start of the question is that in the Soviet Union it's really about emphasizing national motifs and models, and so Yeah.
Yeah, and the case you described, the panel art with national elements, motifs of Renaissance castle. So is it exception or it was like ordinary house? Because I'm historian, I'm not architecture.
Yeah.
Ordinary house was one of many. And the second question is about.
So are you saying did many buildings get the same castle decoration?
No, like national motifs, national elements, which are like typical for this period. And the second question, so I'm historian, I'm very interested in sources, and you said there is not a lot of sources in Czech, and what type of sources did you use, like primary sources?
Okay, so first question is about whether it's a typical building that has these national motifs.
Yeah, in this period.
There are some unique buildings that really have very decorated tops that we can find the source for, like the Tabor, the Schwarzenberg Palace, Lito Michel. In general, the decoration was not necessarily so connected to a very representative building. One of the common things are motifs from nature. So a lot of the buildings have leaves and flowers and some kind of agricultural decoration, especially over the doorways. So you can find these being an idea about naturalism or something in the Czech context, like the beautiful forest and that sort of stuff. I would say that in general, it is typical that the Sorella buildings have this historical decoration that comes from somewhere. We have not done all these I don't know the source of every single one, but these buildings are not that unusual. But they did tend to be highlighted in the ensemble. So maybe the building at the corner had a taller tower, or like in Poruba, the tower in the center had the most decorated top. But in general, this was the strategy, to kind of pull these decorative details and put them on the standardized buildings. The second question is about sources. So what I meant about there not being so many sources in Czech was secondary source materials, because there hadn't been a lot of analysis of this architecture. There's Pechar, which is from 1977 and is really more a kind of cataloging than it is a true analysis, especially because he couldn't really, in 1977 you're not free to say anything you want. There had been some articles done. Pavel Halik had written a nice article in Umění about the topic as a starting point for me. I think that what was unusual about my strategy, or how it turned out because of the flood, was to go straight to the government state archive and start working in files of the Ústřední správa pro bytová občanskou výstavbu, which has huge collection in the National Archive, which is this housing committee. All the conversations about housing from 1956 to the middle of 1958 were through this committee, and the huge archive exists in Chodovec. Nobody had opened any of these boxes before, and I went through a lot of them as much as I could. I only got through some of it, but this for me was a great resource because it brought together many different people having conversations about housing. But what I had to do is read a lot of boring looking documents. I mean, I don't see many pictures in my research, like in the archive. The Stavoprojekt archive exists. It has not been cataloged, and they will not let anybody see it. At least no one I know has seen it, so tell me if you've seen it. But somewhere in Chodovec, there's a giant pile of Stavoprojekt material. They told me that it exists. They've never cataloged it, so there's very few drawings in any of the stuff that I've looked at. I look at meeting minutes, I look at reports, I look at some letters between different people, like between ministries and stuff. Just piles and piles of Xeroxed text is what this came from. Plus the architecture journal, which is critical. And I had a total stroke of luck when I lived here. I found in an antiquariat a full run of Architektura ČSR for sale from 1939 to 1963. And I bought it and I shipped it to America. So in Iowa, I have all these volumes of Architektur CSR that are mine, and I was able to use them for 15 years anytime I want. I don't have to go to the library. I don't have to travel to New York, which is, I think, the closest other set of this journal in the country. And I was at the time at school at Columbia. If I didn't have these journals, it would have been okay. Once I moved to Iowa, it would have been a disaster. I would have had to Xerox or something the whole set. So between the text, documents in the State Archive, and the Architecture magazine, I had an incredibly rich set of materials. The problem was I had no narrative to work with. Like, in my opinion, I was starting pretty much from scratch in terms of what I was going to say. So I have all this great material, all these amazing resources of which I've tapped a tiny bit. I have thousands, of Xerox pages and digitally photographed documents that I've never even had a chance to even really go through. And there's thousands and thousands more in PhotoVets on this stuff. And the problem was what to do with it. How to make the linkages, and this is where I think that I'm happy with how it came out, because after a while my rule was I started to feel good about it when new information fit into the framework that I had and didn't contradict something. So it's like you have a big kind of map of what's happening and each new piece starts to fit, then you kind of know that you're on the right track. Yes.
Okay, go first.
Thank you. Benjamin Tallis from the Institute of International Relations. Thank you very much for the presentation. Perhaps to draw it back slightly to some of the wider political and social issues that are raised by your work and other issues related to it. I mean, these panel arcs are huge material reminders of a very particular period. They are these milestones on the road to a future that never materialized in its own terms, and they're extremely hotly contested sites of memory. And I mean, you know, I've written about this, these myths that actually build up around panel arcs and sidlišķes, which I call panel stories, for obvious reasons. And I think what your work does, perhaps if you could point to the political stake of it, is to really bust one of these myths in a substantial way, that this was an outside imposition and that it was a communist imposition. And it's about busting those myths, which I think your work has been extremely valuable for my own research on. And I think that points us in the direction of a need to reflect more widely again about the memory of that time and the memory of what is organic and internal compared to what is outside and what comes from elsewhere. But there's two other key myths that I would perhaps throw out to the room and see what people would think of. The first myth, the saying being this outside imposition and a communist invention, so we busted through that one. The other two, that the panel arcs and sidlišķes seem to represent a failure, not only a failure of socialism, but a failure of modernism and a failure of social housing. And they're tarred often with the same brush as places like Pruitt-Igoe, as the Toxteth Estate in Liverpool. And we can see how that fits in not only to dominant neoliberal modes of transition and ideas of how we organise public space, how we organise urbanism, but also to the critiques of dissidents and the famous idea of králíkárny and the rabbit pens, undignified rabbit pens slated for destruction as Havel described panel arcs. But also I think there's a third myth, and there's been some anthropological research that's been done on this, but I think we need more, is that people live and will live badly in panel arcs and sidlišķes. And I think busting these other two myths is really crucial to actually dealing with a proper material memory of the communist period and linking it to other forms of memory and other contestations of the culture of the time. So perhaps you could say a little bit about that.
Did you want to add? Yeah, I wanted to add something. I was going to ask a question that was very similar, so I'll add to it. As a French citizen, I'm absolutely fascinated by the success story of the panel arc, the Czech panel arc, compared to what it became in France. That is an utter social disaster, an economic one. And I wanted to push you a little bit on the national dimension of it. What you mentioned a little bit, like if the success of the Czech panel story is not linked to the appropriation really of this way of construction into a national culture or a national way of looking at housing, that would be very different from France, obviously.
Yeah.
And that reminds me at the same time of the question in Hungary, like why would Hungarians not want to have panels? Is for me not surprising because, for instance, Hungarians also absolutely refuse to have Spartakiads. Anything that was uniform, massive, anything that was remotely socialist, they hated. Whereas here, there was a tradition already pre-existing, and it kind of, so-called was very important, and it kind of got recycled into a communist version of it that was more acceptable, maybe to the Czechoslovak population than it would have been to other Central European countries. So I add my own, question on national appropriation of this socialism.
So you're saying that the idea that Czechs were particularly suited to this, in some sense.
I don't know about Czechs, but maybe Czech culture had something in it that made it more possible, easier to accept socialist elements of culture that other countries.
Yeah, I think this is. For me, I'm nervous to go in that direction a little bit. So let me just start with Ben. So. I would say that I love the idea of busting all these myths, if only to allow people to really think through them. I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think what I try to do is open up the space to have the conversation. So I would say that most people I know who grew up, I'm 40, my generation, some of you, grew up in Panalax, and you have good childhood memories of the life. Whether it's good because you had great friends or you remember happy times with your family or something is a different story, but in general, the cultural memory of kids from the 70s and 80s seems to not be so bad. I think that it's also because they didn't have to participate as children in the economy, so they got to go to college, because when they graduated high school, there was no more communism, right? I was in high school when it ended, so were you guys. So I think that this is part of it, that the generation that's now the home buyers, the people who are the young professionals with families looking for places to live, there's less of a resistance to the idea that the Sídliště might be a horrible place than there was for people who are a little bit older than us, who have a different relationship to the state and to the regime, and to the feeling that they were cornered in a sense. As the parents of the kids of the 70s, their only option was a tiny Panelák apartment in some far out Sídliště where the metro didn't go, and there's a whole other set of issues. I think though that the sense that there is something valuable in the density and the green space of the Sídliště, now that the transportation system continues to reach out into more and more Sídliště, I think this is something that's now a relatively mainstream view. I don't say that personally I have too much to do with it, but I do think that by having an outsider like me come and talk about the architecture, that Czechs can talk more about it. I think that it's started some conversations. And as the 2008 housing crisis happened around the world, especially in Hungary, where people essentially bankrupted themselves trying to buy single-family houses with money they don't actually have, and this collapsed so much of the global economy. If we look at Iceland and Latvia and Hungary, I'm sure you know all of this, many countries really bankrupted themselves over housing as an issue. It seems to me that there's a bit of reflection here about the fact that so many people already have a stable place to live, and that not as many Czechs tried to reach out into the suburbs that they couldn't afford in these kind of far-off places. And also people who did, I've heard there's a little bit of a trickle back towards the city now, because people don't like living disconnected from urbanism and from transport and from friends and events. And so I think there are several things happening. In America, for example, we have this very stylish term, transit-oriented design, which is in cities that have transit, which are very few, unfortunately, in the United States. They're trying to design housing that is around transit stations. So like in Minneapolis, there's a light rail system. They're trying to cluster housing at the station and in the immediate area. Well, what else is a Sídliště but a cluster of housing around a transit stop? I mean, tram or metro. Plus, there is the real ethic of the 3-minute walk to the store and the 10-minute walk to transportation. If you really look at it, the way it was designed, you can find this across the whole country. Now the shops are closed in the 3 minutes distance for a lot of places. You know, the small network of shops seems to have collapsed a bit, but you still have pretty close shopping in a lot of places. These are what in America we call smart growth principles, you know, and here it comes back around to say that a lot of the urban design principles of the Siedliště fit very nicely with the smart growth idea. And the problem is, I would say, that the construction quality, the literal construction quality of some of the buildings is really poor, and the degradation of the public space was so significant that it's very hard to get the investment from the public sphere high enough to improve it. So like Muriel lives near Holešovice station, and I came in from Budapest on the train, and I made the old-fashioned mistake of going to the station in Holešovice instead of main station. So I came out into this ghost town of this old station. And if you look at that station and you think, okay, this is what Prague infrastructure looks like, you're going to think that you're back in 1989. I mean, the place is just kind of destroyed. But if you look at main station, it's the total opposite, right? So there's certainly not money for full investment in all infrastructure improvements, and some Siedliště look great in their public space and some don't. So I think that this is part of the issue, that people are always going to bring the worst case scenario, right? They're always going to point to the place that's not been fixed, that still looks really bad. And I think it's culturally hard for anyone to really celebrate 1960s and later. I think that it's really hard for people to celebrate it as some kind of really great development, but it slowly seems to be changing a little bit. Yeah.
Could I just respond very briefly to exactly that point? I think it's something that's been very encouraging in the sort of mnemonic countercurrents that we've been seeing is in the reappraisal of certain buildings from that period, of large marquee public buildings, of the Federal Assembly building, the Nova Scena, of the Narodní divadlo, and I mean the exhibition at the Fragner Gallery back in 2010, actually celebrating Czech brutalism.
Yeah, but this is a global thing. Suddenly these 60s buildings are cool everywhere. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
But that might, I mean, obviously no one is suggesting reappraising the entire period and claiming it was a joyous, wonderful time. That's certainly not the intention. But exactly about rescuing those babies from the bathwater and not throwing them out all together in one is, I think, a significant part of this realization and re-evaluation of memory, as is also the connections drawn to other places. I think, as Muriel was saying as well, I'm realizing these types of building were happening elsewhere, yet it's particularly politically periodizable here, and that seems to be part of the
in the French issue. Conversation we'll save for private because it would be too long, but
how about the Czech one though?
Well, what I was going to say is in the French context there's so many other cultural forces that are pressing on the banlieue, you know, and the ethnic issues, the religious issues, the economic issues that I don't think you have in the same way here. Yeah. So of course we have issues about ethnicity with Roma and economic depression in some of these Siedliště, but the social segregation, the level of social segregation remains so much lower here than in a place like France. And the opportunity to move to better, what people perceive as better places, like the ability to go to a suburb, here actually also seems less because people's salaries just don't support the very expensive housing. Whereas in France you have a much wider range of kind of economic aspiration.
That would kind of emphasize my point, that the famous Czech egalitarianism again played in favor of
definitely, I agree with you completely. I really do. I think that the idea, there's definitely some cultural concept that more people having a minimum standard rather than a few having a very high standard, that this is something that the whole country supports in some deep way, in a very different way than somewhere like America or probably France. Maria had a question,
And in the meantime, the discussion was very interesting, so just a very short comment. That's why our Atlas of Mass Housing in Bratislava was also subtitled Welcome to Panel Story, because this is very important, what was important for us, and I'm neither a historian, you know, my position is much more from the interest in profession as such. That's why I like your research questions in the beginning. And let's say you and Henrietta are also historians and architects and researchers. Yeah. But what I think what your book is doing, and what was our proposal. And what's really, I think, is important is that this teaches us to distinguish the qualitatively which projects of individual types of panelaks or the whole housing estates were and still are of high quality on architectural urban scale, and which were also already planned as a mass housing, almost no architectural sign project, and much more kind of anonymity of authorship project, and that therefore of a lower quality as architecture. So that's very important. And secondly, this was a comment to a previous interesting discussion, which I'm thankful. I think this is amazing for me also that this lecture of yours is framed that we are at the Institute of what in Slovakia we have connected in the title Institute of National Memory, but you have it as an Institute of Study of Totalitarian Regimes, which even I like this linguistic difference. Yeah. I think in the end I will give you a question, but I think this is important that it's framed on this ground, that we shouldn't be a big optimist that these things, even small differences or bigger, smaller differences between Czech, Slovak, Hungarian cultural studies background, which I'm not professional, but much more than that. It's the story of the panelaks or housing estates in Czechoslovakia till '89 speaks very loudly of the mechanism of the regime in Czechoslovakia and how it differed in other Central Eastern European countries, how rigid the system was regarding planning and architecture, how participative architects were till '89. Some of them were realized in 1991, 92, especially Bratislava was slow. And how, in brackets, how anonymous the last period was. Though a big part of the young professionals or mid-aged professionals who then in 90s still are public architects participate in, and many other social activities, not architecture and urbanism, but others, underwent a big memory kind of research in the field of what the regime, how the regime influenced the profession, which is what I really like, how you trace the line of questioning how come this avant-garde architects under capitalism but socially involved turned into what you searched for in 50s, 60s. So my question is how you see in this focus on the profession, what was your kind of outcome and this? How was that? How come it was so easy, or they were so eager? Was it their political orientation before the war, which is clear? I mean, they were all leftist, ideologically intellectuals. And second question is just how the reception of your book, now written a few years ago in States, which I think makes a lot of help for us to be understandable more in the worldwide discourse, which is absolutely amazing that you are you came here to learn the language, to become an insider of the thing, not to write from outside. How this reception changed for you the discourse, or did the reception of your book in States, in the academia, force you to think of some new research? How was this reception for you?
Okay, so first question about the profession.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Schwache said to me very early on, when I first started talking to him, that he felt that the architects, especially in the 50s, really felt that the only way to operate was to provide housing. You know, that they kept their social agenda from the 30s, and that in this terrible kind of political situation of Stalinism and the trials and this kind of stuff, that either you recede into the background completely, you go into the archive or you teach or something, or if you're going to practice, housing is really the only place to operate, you know? And so I've carried that with me in a sense, that I not that Professor Schwache, that he would claim that that this is some kind of fixed conclusion. It was more of an offhand comment that he made to me. But I think that this is the story, that avant-garde modern architects, like the really left-wing ones like Ludwig Hilbersheimer, if you look at his projects, they're much more the scale and the repetition and the craziness of them are so much more than any Siedlichkeit, if they were ever built, which they weren't. That they believed that they were carrying forward what they would call the modern project of providing modern, quality, livable housing to the masses, right? And they were able to propel themselves forward with this belief. I think that this is really true. This is why some people say to me, any architect who was still working in the 70s, that like Antonín Tenzer, I think, became controversial towards the end of his life because he continued working past 68, that there was supposed to be a line at which you didn't cross. After 68, if you kept working, you were basically saying false things to yourself, because by that point it was obvious that this was a corrupt situation. I think that that is a little bit of a, that there's a problem with that interpretation, primarily because the generation that I write about, we're all dying in the 1960s. So, Kroha dies the same week I was born, isn't that crazy? June 1974, he dies, and he's already pretty old and not in good health by, the late 60s. You lose Fuchs and I think Honzik, some of these guys are disappearing. So they were not faced with the choice, right? We don't know necessarily what choice they would make. The ones who had to make that choice were the generation of Vojenilek and Janu and Storza, who were born not in the 19th century, like Taiga I think is 1899. They were born like in 1910, 1915, and they were basically super young during World War II, and they came out after the war, and that's when they started their practice. I think that they were the ones faced with the hard choice, and many of them did continue to work or at least do some kind of research. And I think they carried themselves forward with this belief that they had made a big contribution, and at some point there's no turning back. They're technocratic, bureaucratic, communist architects. This is what they do. Janu writes some interesting books actually in the 70s that were helpful to me to kind of understand technology and architecture as a system. About stavebnictví. The former minister of stavebnictví is writing about stavebnictví. I don't know. I think okay. So that's one thing, and then the reception in the United States is quiet in general. Everyone, I've been asked. I've had 3 media interviews, and I've had this question 3 times. So this is the 4th time. Like, what do Americans think about this? So this is what I'll say. In architectural history, people know about my work. I give papers at conferences. The people most interested research post-war modern architecture globally. And I'm seen as just a person doing one of the stories. Czechoslovakia was one place in the world after the war where there was interesting architecture. It's only here, and among other Eastern European architectural historians, that what I consider to be the contribution of my arguments are really understood at the deep level. Because if you don't know anything about the history of communism, it's very hard to understand why I would spend 12 years trying to figure out how a panelak is made. And so, to the Americans, it's insight into the system that we are taught is bad. As an American, you spend your whole life being educated, especially American born in the 70s, you're educated that communism is evil. And when the wall came down, what was on the other side of the wall was mysterious. And that's why you had all these American scholars learning the languages and coming over. We were trying to find some mysterious information. And when I went to Ostrava for the first time in 2002, not many of you had been to Ostrava, I can tell you that. And I know Osamu had not really. So the point being that even in your own country, there's still mystery 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And now that's not the case. People go to Ostrava all the time, and people go to Bratislava. But when I started to travel to these places, people thought I was a little bit weird. Why are you going to these far-flung places, Rozdílov and Kladno, these kind of strange edge places. And so in that sense, for Americans, they can't even understand that. They don't understand the multiple layers that you're going down into when you write about something like Poruba in Ostrava, in the context of industrialization and the context of communism in Czechoslovakia. So, people have all the reviews of my book, there's been many reviews in English, some in Czech, in French, in Russian, that they are all positive about the work. Everyone's interested, they like the quality of the work and stuff. But like I said, that's why I'm here, because it's like the moment for me to truly get some feedback and have a conversation where people really understand what the stakes are. Because in the United States, it's hard for people to understand the stakes. I have wonderful colleagues who write about Eastern Europe who live in America, so we have a kind of research group of people, none of whom write about Czech stuff. So Yugoslav, Hungarian, Polish, Soviet, Russian, Baltic, Bulgarian. You know, there's people basically working on all the countries, and I'm the one for Czechoslovakia. And Henrietta sometimes comes over the ocean and talks. Yes. So, but it's for various reasons. People writing about Czechoslovakia have stayed away from this period, especially in cultural production. It's starting to change. Few people, but it's very hard to give up on writing about Deviet Seal and all this amazing graphic design and beautiful things. If that's your field, and you bother to learn Czech. You know, why not go for the sexy stuff? And this is what happened.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for noticing that the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regime is open-minded, and that we do value studying continuities that are in fact very important. And I think for me that was the really most important element of what you said today, was this continuity from before 48 to after 48. And of course the continuities before to after 89 are equally important if we are to understand, you know, the stability of this regime and how it could even, you know, last and even manage to some extent, despite being a dictatorship, to also create some sources of legitimacy for itself. And we will never understand communism if we don't also study that aspect. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For coming.
Thanks everyone for coming.
I just want to say that we have a glass of wine, right? Oh, no? No glass of wine, just coffee. Sorry.
Water and
Water and coffee in your bag, and of course you are free to continue asking many questions to Kim.
Yeah, and we're going to do
And
some
you're
kind of,
also very welcome to buy the book that is selling on the table here.
And I think we're going to do some little presentation of the book, yeah? That's what you wanted to do. Yeah, to say a few words about the book.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I guess this is the official kind of chest for the book for me, because I'm only in Prague for a few days, and the translation came out at the end of February officially. My translator is here. I want her to stand up and say hello. Alena, who did an amazing job. Thank you. And Maria Bomova is here from academia. Thank you. So just to say a couple things, academia came to me and asked me if I would let them translate the book. And they put it in this series, Šťastné zítřky, which for me was quite an honor, because there's amazing books in this series, and I think there's no better title for a series than Happy Tomorrows for what I do. I really love this name. And they did a beautiful job on the book, and like I said, it's such a satisfying thing for me to know that all of you can read it in your own language, in a translation that is absolutely expert, because for me this is the way to get to that deep critique and kind of deep conversation, because as great as everyone's English is, in terms of talking and stuff, there's really some stuff that I feel you should read in Czech. And also, Alena made me rightly dig out every document, so all the quotes that I had translated to English are now back to their original Czech, and you can read what was written in the archive, what exists in the archive, and if anybody wants to trace it, it's all there. You know, you can see the font number and the cardinal, this stuff. So for me, that's why I really want to thank Alena for her work, and also academia for coming to me and asking, because in fact I was trying to find somebody to do a translation, and it wasn't necessarily clear who it would be, and I can't think of a better situation than this, to have it in this series with such a great publisher. So that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you.